Hello again, everyone, and welcome to part 5 of our lecture series for chapter 25 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled Vietnam and the New Left. The focus question for this section is, how did the Vietnam War transform American politics and culture? The 1960s also saw the emergence of a new social and political force within the United States, the New Left. This New Left challenged mainstream American values and the Old Left, best represented by the Progressive Era or FDR's New Dealers. This New Left featured the rise of young, socially and politically conscious college students who spoke of loneliness, isolation, and alienation in a bureaucratic society whose affluence denied authenticity. This movement was not as new as it claimed, however, as it drew inspiration from the rhetoric of the American Revolution, from 19th century abolitionists, from the Old Left Progressive Era. But its greatest inspiration was drawn from the Black Freedom Movement, which was concurrent with the New Left, which basically posited that evils were embedded within social institutions and required direct confrontation. The rise of this New Left movement and its related rhetoric, ideals, and ideologies was facilitated by a fading consensus in American society in the 1960s. After World War II, and with the rise of Cold War era tensions, the late 1940s and 1950s was probably the period in American history where Americans were the most unified. There was the most social and political consensus amongst the American populace. Well, as the 1960s rolled around and the United States entered its second full decade of the Cold War era, those Cold War tensions were no longer enough to maintain that social and political consensus. And new intellectuals began to emerge that wrote pivotal books that challenged that 1950s era consensus. These included authors like James Baldwin and his work The Fire Next Time, which really captured the anger of African Americans in this period. Rachel Carson and her work The Silent Spring, which highlighted the environmental costs of economic growth and really was the spark that launched the modern environmental movement. Also, Jane Jacobs and her work The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which criticized urban renewal programs. All of these things and more were injected into the American consciousness and began to fracture that consensus that had lasted since the conclusion of the Second World War. The New Left movement first really came into general public consciousness in 1962 with the formation of a student activist group known as Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, who issued a manifesto known as the Port Huron Statement. And this manifesto was really a criticism of American institutions and proposed a new vision for social change via a participatory democracy. And when they talked about a participatory democracy, they of course meant in politics and government, but they also meant in other institutions like the workplace, in schools, within the American family unit itself. SDS membership grew quickly on college campuses across the nation, and the SDS was really thrust to the forefront of the news in 1964 when the University of California at Berkeley prohibited political groups from using a central area of campus. The SDS organized what became known as the Free Speech Movement on the University of California at Berkeley campus, and instigated a series of protests over the next several months, which actually forced the college to rescind its prohibition from using that central area of campus for political groups. Opposition to American involvement in the Vietnam War transformed student protests like the free speech movement in Berkeley into a generational rebellion. Few Americans had any knowledge of Vietnam's history and culture, which of course led to serious blunders on the part of the United States in its policy toward Vietnam from the very beginning. And the whole project became a test of this idea of containment, this Cold War era U.S. policy of trying to prevent the spread of communism at any cost. And the war in general revealed the danger of viewing the world through the lens of this Cold War, black and white, good and evil ideology. At the end of Kennedy's term, before he was assassinated, Kennedy did begin to question American involvement in Vietnam, but he did not pull America out of the war. And when LBJ took office, he actually escalated the conflict. In August of 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, and this was an episode where allegedly a small group of North Vietnamese vessels fired upon U.S. naval warships in the Gulf of Tonkin. There was a lot of controversy, continues to be lots of controversy around this incident, and questions remain on whether the North Vietnamese actually did fire upon these U.S. naval vessels. However, regardless of that, much like the situation with the USS Maine in the harbor of Havana that led to the declaration of war against Spain in the Spanish-American War in 1898, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, true or not, was used as an excuse by the Lyndon Johnson administration to escalate the Vietnam War. Very quickly after the incident, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized the president to take all necessary measures in Vietnam. And Johnson immediately began authorizing airstrikes on North Vietnam and sent more troops to Vietnam in 1965. The conduct of the war was brutal on both sides, with atrocities and war crimes being committed on each side of the conflict, and ever-increasing numbers of American troops were sent to Vietnam up through 1968. However, no matter how brutal the fighting got or how many troops the United States sent to Vietnam, all these measures failed to break the Vietnamese will or ability to fight. By the late 1960s, there was widespread opposition to the war. Americans in general grew tired of seeing young American men being sent way overseas to fight for a cause that many were questioning or didn't believe in a country that few knew anything about. College students were exempt from the draft, so the burden of fighting fell to the working class and the poor. And much like many other conflicts in United States history, most notably the Civil War, the Vietnam War was very much a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. To the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, the war was the opposite of its participatory democratic vision, and the SDS had a big hand in organizing and galvanizing the anti-war movement. Resistors began burning their draft cards and fleeing to Canada in droves. Of course, no discussion of the 1960s would be complete without a discussion of the rise of a new counterculture, or hippie culture, in the 1960s. And this was really a social manifestation of the sort of leftist political ideologies embodied by the New Left movement. And the counterculture really advocated for cultural freedom and the rejection of authority, and became a mass movement for personal liberation. The definition of freedom was transformed at this time as the right to individual choice. And the countercultural movement in general was a rebellion against and release from bureaucratized education and work, repressive behavioral norms, and a militarized state that wreaked destruction on distant lands. It really fostered a new spirit of creative experimentation in art, in clothing, of course in music, and with images and ideologies of sexual liberation and sexual freedom. It spread these messages in new forms of radical action, including underground independent newspapers, and they emphasized the ideal of community. About 2,000 hippie communes were established in rural areas across the country, some more successful and longer lasting than others. That concludes part 5 of our Chapter 25 lecture series for your textbook Giving Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. But don't go anywhere yet. Still a couple of more parts to go. Indeed, there's a lot to cover about the 1960s. Until next time, study hard, and I'll see you soon.